Time to take a look at Soviet anti-tank rifle tactics of World War II. Now, although anti-tank rifles seem rather weak compared to anti-tank or tank guns, the Soviet ones caused plenty of trouble for the German Panzerwaffe. Enough that the so-called Schürzen, usually translated with armor skirts, were introduced in 1943 to protect the rather weakly armored sides of most Panzers and Sturmgeschütze, as you can see here on the Panzer IV. The Soviets had two main types of anti-tank rifles, the single-shot PTRD and the semi-automatic PTRS. The latter is discussed in greater depth on my second channel in this video. Both had a caliber of 14.5 mm. For comparison, here you can see the size difference between a clip of 14.5 mm cartridges of the PTRS versus an M1 Guderian clip with 7.62 mm. Yet enough for the weapons for now. Let us look what the Soviets wrote in their manuals on their tactics and experiences. Now, the manual from 1942 starts off in a tone that is quite different to the very sober German field regulations I usually look at. Destroy fascist tanks with the anti-tank rifle. This overall tone continues throughout the instructions to a certain degree, yet I try to focus on the essential aspects. Anyway, the second section shortly outlines the capabilities of the different anti-tank rifles, the PTRS and the PTRD. Here the rate of fire for the PTRS is given with 15 shots per minute, whereas for the PTRD the number is 8 to 10 shots. Although both weapons had the same ammo, the maximum range is given differently. The maximum range of the self-loading rifle PTRS is 1500 meters. The single-shot PTRD is 1000 meters. The best results can be achieved at a range of 300 to 400 meters or closer. The explanation for this is likely to the different sides. The PTRD-41 that Ian from Forgotten Weapons had available in his video had only a flip switch between 400 and 600 meters, whereas the PTRS that Philip had access to had a far more sophisticated sight ranging from 100 to 1500 meters. According to Philip, this one was an original World War II PTRS. I assume the same for Ian's PTRD, although I don't know if both of these rifles were standard issue or not. I'm rather hesitant to draw conclusions from single instances, yet for now it seems to be the most logical reason for this. Let's move on. Another important element of the manual was about positioning. The headline was, "Skillfully create your firing positions." The general guidelines were as follows. Pick and prepare a position such that you can see and shoot in any direction the enemy may come from at a range of 500 to 1500 meters. It is hidden from observation from ground and air. It has hidden paths and cover in case of artillery or mortar bombardment. You can see your commander and neighbors. So let us look now at some example positions. The first position was in the open. In the center of the position was a dugout that should have a roof made out of wooden beams or similar material. Furthermore, it should be covered with dirt. From this dugout, there were several trenches leading to the actual firing positions that were foxhole that should allow the soldier to fire in every direction. Note, there was also a trench that connected the position to the rear as well. The manual notes about the use of the dugout. When you are fired upon by mortars and artillery, seek shelter in your dugout. When enemy tanks approach, immediately take up positions and shoot them up. Hence, the soldiers were protected against artillery and mortar strikes that often were used to suppress defenders. Once these strikes were over, they could move into action when the tanks approached. The instructions for the position near the forest are rather simple. As you can see, the center of the position is located at the edge of the forest. The manual notes, when setting up in a transitional area, move your trenches up, hide them with bushes. In your firing sector, mow down the grass and bushes. Note, this is the only guideline for the forest setup. This might be that there were not much more to say, but might also reflect the fact that panzer forces, if possible, avoided forests. For several reasons, to quote from the German army regulations for the Panzer Company from May 1941, when fighting in the forest, the danger of sudden attacks by the enemy from close distance is particularly heightened. Increased attention must be paid to provide constant covering fire among the tanks. Additionally, although a tree might not seem like a challenge for a tank like the Panzer III or IV, which both had around 20 tons at that time, well, the armor regulation seems to differ. Forests can often also be crossed by tanks outside of aisles and paths. This is made more difficult by dense strong tree population and dense undergrowth. Forests with trunks less than 25 cm in diameter can be crossed by Panzerkampfwagen 3 and 4. This reduces their speed. For forests with trunks over 25 cm diameter and so dense that the tanks must hit 2 trees, can only be gnawed through by Panzerkampfwagen 3 and 4. Note that the original of gnawed through was durchnagen, a word usually used when describing the biting action of a rodent. If you want to learn more about this army regulation, you can. Military Aviation History and I translated the whole regulation into English, and it's presented side by side with the original German text. Of course, it comes with plenty of footnotes for explanations and an appendix on important terminology as well. Anyway, back to the Soviet manual. The final point of this section was about a defense setup for populated areas. As expected, positions should be prepared in the available structures or around them. Furthermore, firing ports should be properly concealed. If you made a firing port in a building wall, hide it with straw, boards, plywood or other available materials. By the way, if you want to learn more about urban combat fighting positions, be sure to check out this video, which is based on a recent US Marines field manual. There are also some general points about cover and concealment. First off, that natural or existing covers should be used. If there is no time to make firing positions, use local objects, unevenness in terrain, trenches, moats, bushes, stumps, craters, etc. And of course, the positions that are too obvious or standing out should, if possible, be avoided. If using a hill for cover, do not set up on the top of the hill and trench on the left or right side. Do not use readily identifiable objects for cover, lone trees, lone buildings, rocks, stumps, etc. The next part is about firing at the tank. As many of you might know that have experience with firing guns or know what a ballistic curve is, it all begins with proper ranging the target. As also lately covered in my video on German sniper training, reliable estimation of the distance forms the basis for accuracy. Similarly, the Soviets wrote, to shoot without missing, it's important to determine the distance to your target. Know the vulnerable spots of tanks and armored cars, know how to choose the point of aim. Ideally, one would survey the terrain and gather the different ranges. Yet sometimes this was not possible, hence the instruction was, train yourself to mentally find landmarks 100 to 200 meters apart. Of course, the ideal firing distance was rather up close and personal. Let the enemy approach to a close range 50 to 100 meters. This made sense for several reasons. First off, the chance to hit is significantly improved. Second, the penetration values at close ranges are higher. And third, due to its limited penetration values and far less damage potential compared to anti-tank guns, anti-tank rifle fire was usually directed at weak spots on a tank. And these were usually rather small. Thus hitting the right spot was of far greater importance. Something discussed in more detail later. As mentioned earlier, the armor skirts for the Panzers were introduced since the anti-tank rifles were often capable of penetrating the side armor. And since Panzers tend to move, it is not surprising that a significant portion of the manual was dedicated on instructions on how to properly lead one's aim against moving targets. So the next time you ambush a Panzer that moves about 25 to 30 km per hour at 400 meter distance, this would be the proper lead. Now in case the Panzer moves faster or is about 500 meters away, make sure to lead it a bit more. Also keep in mind that at ranges of less than 400 meters, use 400 meter setting on your sight. After all, there's so much space in Russia that below 400 meters it is just a stone throw away. Now jokes aside, here we have a possible error in the manual. Although the manual distinguishes between the PTRD and the PTRS, particularly on different ranges, here it does not. Assuming that the PTRS I had access to was standard issue, this information is wrong, because as you can see, the PTRS had a range setting for 100, 200 and 300 meters as well. Of course, the PTRD that Ian took a look at had the lowest setting with 400 meters, so this information is very likely only meant for the PTRD users. Yet let us move on to engaging tanks with your respective anti-tank rifle. Ideally this should be done when they were slow. After all, as Generaloberst Heinz Guderian noted, the engine of the Panzer is a weapon just as the main gun. This becomes also apparent here. When firing on tanks, try to take advantage of the enemy's surprise, lowered speed, turns and stops. Now it is important to remember that some tanks back then turned a bit less smoothly than modern tanks do. As you can see here with the Panzer IV of the Panzermuseum Munster, for a tight turn it almost stops. Speaking of Panzers, the instructions also outline the weak points of tanks and armored cars. Namely, the most vulnerable parts of tanks and armored cars are the sides, gas tanks, drive wheel, sights, observation devices, the rear, engine, or the front for armored cars. Specifically, they include an illustration of a Panzer III. Note that in some cases some errors depicted in the manual don't add up with the text. I asked Peter about this, and it seems that either the captions are incomplete, incorrect, or some of the errors are misplaced. I depict such errors with a dotted line. The fire should be aimed at the vision ports, although for this arrow there is no vision point there. The fuel tank, although here's another problem, the marked area is clearly larger than the actual fuel tank, or the engine for that matter. Although there is armor located in this area, but armor is not mentioned in the captions, nor does it reach up to the top of the hull, nor forward to the center roller in any sources I've seen so far. The next caption notes shooting for the sides, turret, fuel tank and engine. Here 3 lines point to the rollers, 1 line at the idler wheel and 1 at the sprocket wheel or maybe the tracks, none of which are mentioned in the captions according to Peter. Finally, the text notes cannon, but the arrow seems to indicate one of the machine guns, not the main gun. As such, I'm a bit confused here. I can understand a misidentification with the fuel tank location, but the rollers and wheels seems rather odd. My only guess is that this might have been taken from an anti-tank manual and recaptioned, since I doubt any anti-tank rifle can damage the rollers nor the wheels consistently and sufficiently, although the general weakness quote mentioned the drive wheels. The manual also contains a section about maneuvering and cooperation with submachine gunners, grenadiers and incendiary bottle throwers. And this statement makes it clear what the strengths of the anti-tank rifles were. The main tactical requirement for anti-tank rifles is mobility in all cases in battle. The lightweight of the rifle, convenience of transportation, simple setup of firing positions, possibility of using natural cover, all this makes the crew of an anti-tank rifle invincible. Unlike anti-tank guns, anti-tank rifles were quite mobile and thus ideal for flanking. This is further illustrated by the following points. Learn and use in practice. Have backup firing positions at all times. Make 5 to 10 shots from one position, then move. If enemy tanks move in a direction unfavorable to you, occupy a new position and shoot them in the rear. Maneuver on the battlefield. Send tanks to places where they are vulnerable to other anti-tank rifle crews. When fighting with other crews and infantry, know your objectives and the objectives of your neighbors. When supporting grenadiers or incendiary bottle throwers, know what direction they are hiding in and do not fire in that direction. If a tank has stopped, knock out its armament first. Now on the general employment of anti-tank rifle units I have a few points. The first one is from the Soviet War documents and war experience in 1941. Be aware that the translation went with anti-tank guns, not anti-tank rifles, whereas anti-tank guns are translated as anti-tank artillery. Use anti-tank rifles in the defense as part of a company or platoon on directions favorable for tanks, so as not to allow their equal distribution along the entire front of the unit. Echelon the anti-tank rifle subunits in depth, and always have a reserve of these weapons to reinforce directions which are favorable for tanks and to repel an attack of enemy tanks from a new direction. In the system of anti-tank defense of the unit, coordinate the fire of anti-tank rifles with artillery fire and the system of engineer obstacles. So similar to tanks, these weapons should be focused on specific areas of the front. Other points mention that the position should be set up ideally to provide flanking fire. Furthermore, if possible, to deploy the units behind anti-tank obstacles, since that slows the tanks down and often provides shots of opportunity, especially if they have to cross them and thus exposing the weakly armored hull floor. During offensives, the anti-tank rifles should be used directly with the advancing infantry. The second one is from the Soviet General Staff Study for the Battle of Kursk. It notes the following. Light mortars were deployed in trenches, while heavy machine guns had specifically equipped fighting positions deployed in the gaps between the trenches. As a rule, anti-tank rifle companies were used in platoons or squads along dangerous tank axes. They were deployed direct in the first trench line or in specifically equipped fighting positions behind the trenches. For more information on the defensive tactics at Kursk, be sure to check out this video, which provides an in-depth view on the defensive organization and positions. The manual also contained points about maintenance, fire discipline, and target priority. The latter 2 points are rather similar to everything else I read so far, namely fire only on predetermined timing, command, or emergency, and engage the most dangerous targets first. Be sure if you want to learn more about the semi-automatic PTRS to check out this video, or if you want to learn more about the single-shot PTRD to check out Ian's video on forgotten weapons. Anyway, the next time you need to hold the line against some Panzers, you know what to do. Big thank you here to Phil for providing access and information on the PTRS. Big thank you also to Peter for doing the original translation and answering my questions. Thanks to Chieftain for helping me with the fuel tank position. Thanks to Jens for helping with further translations. Thank you to the Panzermuseum Munster for inviting me to Stahl auf der Heide 2019. Thank you to the Tank Museum at Bovington for inviting me in 2017. And of course, thank you to my Patreon and Subscribestar supporters that make videos like this possible. As always, sources are listed in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.